Okay, let's dive into this explainer. I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine opening your morning newspaper back in May of 1864. You're sitting in a quiet, comfortable parlor up north, and you're desperately scanning the pages, right? You're looking for news of your sons, your brothers, your husbands who are marching south with General Ulysses S. Grant. You are, of course, hoping for a swift, decisive end to a grueling war. And what you read, well, it's pretty reassuring. But what was actually happening on the ground down in Virginia? It was a literal nightmare. Today, we're going to explore this massive, horrifying gap between public expectation and the grim, agonizing reality of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. So check this out. On May 21st, 1864, the Hartford Daily Courant runs this front-page dispatch from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and he's assuring the public that General Grant's movements down in central Virginia were entirely satisfactory. He says the army is abundantly supplied, and get this, he literally says that it was all quiet. I mean, for a northern public that was just eager for a quick, relatively painless victory, these words were a soothing balm. It painted this incredibly rosy, optimistic picture of a well-oiled military machine just smoothly advancing on the Confederate capital. Well, we need to shatter that illusion right now, because the reality on the ground was that all quiet was a complete, profound myth. The campaign these men were currently engaged in would cement itself as one of the most miserable, agonizing, and flat-out deadly of the entire war. Instead of some smooth march to Richmond, these guys found themselves trapped in a 12-day, blood-soaked, muddy meat grinder, something that pushed human endurance way, way past its absolute breaking point.
Part 1. Expectations versus reality. Coming out of the staggering, just massive losses of the Wilderness Campaign, both armies started moving south. On one side, you've got General Grant commanding a massive force. We're talking 111,000 Union men. They hold a huge numerical advantage, they are well supplied, and honestly, they've got strong morale. Facing them, General Robert E. Lee with roughly 63,000 Confederate troops. Now, what Lee lacks in numbers and equipment, his guys make up for with extreme tenacity, battle-hardened experience, and the distinct advantage of defensive entrenchments. It was like this massive, high-stakes chess match, where the entire outcome would depend on who made the very first mistake.
Part 2. Race to the Crossroads. So Spotsylvania Courthouse is the prize here. It was this absolutely crucial crossroads, sitting right between the wilderness and the railroads that supplied Lee's army. Basically, if Grant got there first, he had a wide-open path straight to Richmond. But, spoiler alert, Lee beat him to it. How? Well, first, Confederate General Pendleton proactively cut this secret trail right through the woods, giving Lee a direct, unknown route. Sneaky, right? Second, Confederate cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart started throwing up barricades of logs and fence rails, severely delaying the Union troops. And meanwhile, the Union march was just plagued by terrible traffic jams. In fact, General Meade was famously furious to find General Sheridan's cavalrymen literally sleeping at Todd's Tavern, completely blocking the infantry. These Union blunders, mixed with brilliant Confederate maneuvers, allowed the South to seize the high ground literally minutes before the Union V Corps arrived.
But there was actually another, much darker reason the Confederates won that race. See, Confederate General Richard Anderson was ordered to move his men toward Spotsylvania, but he wasn't really told to rush. However, his men began their march early, at 10 p.m. on May 7th, and they marched through the entire night without stopping once. Why? Well, because the wilderness battlefield they were leaving was, as the historical sources describe it, engulfed in fire and the stench of dead bodies. It was physically impossible to sleep or even set up camp in that literal hellscape. They marched all night purely to escape the horror, and by doing so, they inadvertently won the strategic race to the crossroads.
Part 3. The Bloody Angle. Okay, to really understand the climax of this battle, you have to picture the terrain they were fighting over. The Confederates rapidly built a 5-mile trench line, but their engineers realized they had a massive problem. To follow the high ground, they've created this huge mile-long bulge pointing directly north toward the Union Army. The soldiers called it the Mule Shoe. And because it bulged outward, it could be attacked from the front and both sides at the exact same time. It was a massive tactical vulnerability. But General Lee opted to keep it, trusting his artillery to hold the line. General Grant, on the other hand, he immediately saw a golden opportunity. And one single tactical error quickly escalated into a complete massacre. Here's exactly how it unfolded. On May 10th, a young Union colonel named Emory Upton led a surprise attack with 12 hands-picked regiments, and they temporarily broke the Confederate line before being pushed back. This little probe gave Grant an idea for a massive assault. Then a fatal mistake happens.
On the rainy night of May 11th, the Confederates mistakenly believed Grant was retreating, so they actually removed their artillery from the Muleshoe. Big mistake. At dawn on May 12th, Union General Hancock launched a massive assault right at the top of the salient, easily capturing the position and taking thousands of prisoners. But the sheer size of the Union victory kind of disorganized them. By 9:30 a.m., Lee launched brutal, desperate counterattacks to plug that gap. What followed, honestly, defies human comprehension. The Union and Confederate forces just crashed into each other at the northern face of the salient, an area that would forever be known as the Bloody Angle. Fresh troops were constantly shoved into the melee. They fought in pouring rain. They fought in trenches that were quite literally overflowing with water and blood. And this fierce, hand-to-hand combat, it continued totally uninterrupted for 23 straight hours. Think about that, 23 hours. To really wrap your head around the sheer, terrifying volume of gunfire during those 23 hours, consider this one astonishing detail that was recorded from the battlefield. Sometime around 2 a.m., a massive oak tree, we're talking 20 inches in diameter, literally crashed to the ground. Now, it hadn't been chopped down. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't hit by a cannonball either. Its thick wooden trunk was completely severed purely by the relentless, concentrated storm of flying musket balls. It is such a chilling testament to the sheer density of lead that was filling the air that night.
Part 4. The Breaking Point.
So, while the public back home was reading in their comfy parlors about a well-supplied, smoothly operating army, the stark reality of camp life was breaking men apart. The continuous operations, the unprecedented slaughter they just witnessed, the pouring rain, the sheer exhaustion, it all took a massive toll. Discipline began to completely crack, and commanders, well, they resorted to highly visible, severe physical punishments just to maintain order and make examples out of unruly soldiers. See, you had this influx of new, drafted recruits, some of whom were just there to collect an enlistment bounty and run. And they clashed heavily with exhausted veterans whose 3-year enlistments were expiring anyway. The breakdown was everywhere. Soldiers would shirk or straggle, basically just dropping out of line right before a battle started. Theft became rampant. One recruit noted men having hundreds of dollars stolen from them while they slept. There was open insubordination, with men just refusing to do fatigue duty. And, most terrifying to the commanders, there was widespread desertion. Men would literally scan the mountains and just wait for the weather to clear to make a run for it. To stop the army from dissolving from the inside out, officers enforced extreme, absolutely brutal punishments. If a soldier was caught stealing, a really common punishment was having half of their head shaved and then being paraded through the camp wearing a massive placard that just read, "Thief." For insubordination, a guy might be tied up by his thumb so his feet barely even touch the ground. Another common grueling punishment was being bucked and gagged. That's where a soldier's hands were tied in front of his knees, a stick was placed over his elbows and under his knees, and then a bayonet or a piece of wood was tied right into his mouth. But for the ultimate crime of desertion, the punishment was absolute. Remember that newspaper on May 21st saying everything was all quiet? The very day before that was published, Private John D. Starbird was executed for deserting his colors twice. The sources detail these harrowing executions, like those of George Blowers and John Taji. The entire division would be formed into a square. The condemned men were forced to kneel directly on top of their own wooden coffins. Paper hearts were pinned to their chests as targets. A band played a dead march, and then they were shot by a firing squad made up of their own comrades. The army was quite literally executing its own men just to hold the ranks together.
Part 5. The Grim Aftermath.
After the absolute horrors of the Bloody Angle, the weather decided to become just as formidable an enemy as the opposing army. From May 13th to the 16th, torrential, non-stop rain soaked the battlefields, turning all the roads into deep mud and bogging down operations completely. Grant tried to shift his lines to attack weak points, but the mud and Confederate artillery held him back. On May 18th, a final massive Union assault was just blasted apart by Confederate cannons. On May 19th, a desperate Confederate reconnaissance mission resulted in heavy, chaotic fighting as the daylight faded. And finally, on May 20th, both armies, just utterly, totally spent, disengaged and continued their bloody march south. Let's look at the numbers, because the human toll of these 12 days is absolutely staggering. The Union Army lost almost 18,000 men from their original strength of 111,000. That includes top commanders like General Sedgwick, who was killed by a sharpshooter. The Confederate Army suffered smaller numerical losses, between 8,000 and 10,000 men. But remember, that was from a much smaller starting pool of just 63,000. Tactically, it was a stalemate.
Grant failed to destroy Lee's army, and Lee merely delayed Grant's inevitable push southward.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Historically, the Union Army claimed a larger strategic march toward Richmond as a win. But when you really look at it, when you look at the 23 hours of nonstop hand-to-hand slaughter, the executions of their own soldiers just to maintain basic discipline, and the staggering loss of over 26,000 Americans combined in just 12 days, can a victory truly be claimed here? It forces us to peer past those optimistic newspaper headlines of the time and really reckon with the absolute, agonizing true cost of war. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.